This month's Where Did the Road Go is brought to you by three wonderful people, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, and 36 Dingo. It is also made possible by all of my Patreons, and if you want to become a patron, www.wheredidtheroadgo.com.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this supersized edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have, let's see here, Nathan Issacs of Pennyroyal.
How's it going?
Taylor of the Green Lion podcast.
Howdy.
Chris Ernst.
Hello, hello.
Octavian of Strange Dominions.
Hello.
And Super Inframan.
Hello, hello.
And Nathan, like we talked about you joining us for a roundtable last time we talked, and after I put the show up, people kept saying, "Why don't you bring Nathan into a roundtable?" I'm like, it's coming, all right?
I'm excited, man. When you hit me up, I was like, oh yeah, that's awesome. I'm super excited.
So this will be just sort of a Wandering the Road episode. I mean, if anyone has anything they want to talk to Nathan about, of course, he's sort of the newbie here, but you know, with Pennyroyal and stuff, and I'm pretty sure all of you have listened to Pennyroyal, so. But
oh yeah, great stuff.
Also, thank you guys for listening to Pennyroyal.
It's a great show.
I was confused because you had sent me your last episode before we talked. And,
right? It was a preview, you know?
And so you just dropped the last episode last week.
Yeah.
And I'm like, another episode of Pennyroyal? And I clicked it, and I'm listening to it. I'm like, I know I've heard this before. But, of course, I didn't remember all of it because there's so much stuff there. And I'm going, oh, maybe it's just a different edit? Like, what is this? And finally I'm going, I think maybe this is the one he sent me. Is that what happened? And finally I had to message you, and you're like, yeah, that's what happened. I'm like, okay, good. All right.
There was a moment, though, that you made me question reality, and I thought, oh, no, I screwed up and I uploaded the wrong episode.
You know, it happens. I don't think I've ever uploaded the wrong episode. I think I've uploaded the wrong Patreon episode before.
Do you know, I have noticed, and I'm saying this publicly, this is no offense to the gentleman Whitley Strieber, but I noticed a couple of times recently there has been some snafus in the uploads to Dreamland, and
really?
I cringe whenever I in sympathy, in empathy for anyone when that's happening.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, it happens.
You label something right. It doesn't take much, honestly, you know. Bad labeling, just, you know, not thinking about everything you're supposed to be thinking about. But,
Yep,
all right.
Click on the wrong thing.
Clicking on the wrong thing, yeah. So, one of the things I had wanted to talk about in our last roundtable show that we didn't get to was the fact that somebody blew up the Georgia Guidestones. And
Yeah, so I just heard about this fairly recently on the Slack channel. I haven't looked too deep into it, so I'm really curious to hear your guys' perspectives on.
Same, because I don't really know that much. I know like what they are, and I know what happened, but I don't know much of the background or history behind them.
So who wants to take it?
Well, see, I can see what I can throw out there. I think they were erected in the early 80s, if I remember right, and it was sort of directions on how to rebuild civilization. And
honestly, and pretty common sense ones, honestly, for the most part.
Yeah, very, very straightforward stuff for the most part. It's in, I think, is it 4 different languages, something like that?
Might be more than that.
8.
That was 8.
Oh, 8.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yep.
Thank you. You've got some of the astronomical alignments on there too, so it works as a calendar and a clock as well. And of course, the mystery of it though too was who built the Guidestones. The person that commissioned them used an alias of R.C. Christian, and that left a lot of intrigue around them. In light of that too, there's also a time capsule that was under the Guidestones that I haven't heard much about. But there was no date on when it was supposed to be open, just that it was under there somewhere. But there's a lot of really good investigative work that people have done to narrow R.C. Christian down to a guy named Herbert Kirsten, I believe. Is that the right name, Yul?
I believe that is, yeah.
Yeah. I always call him Dr. Kirsten, and then there was another guy named Marvin that was around there too.
Right.
But he had some very interesting and different ideas. But a lot of the things that kind of brought this together was R.C. Christian's home address was also Herbert Kirsten's. And there were some other kind of unique things that Herbert Kirsten got into that were more around eugenics and things like that, which cast a different light on the more general qualities of where the Guidestones talk about building strength and diversity and things that make it a complicated topic in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that light, the first three in particular items on the Guidestones are pretty controversial when you kind of throw in the eugenics aspect.
Yeah, and he was known to support David Duke and people like that back in their much more high-profile days, when he was very out front of the Klan and things like that. And so when you start looking at his interest and control over reproduction, it's like, oh, this is creepy.
Yep.
And so I get very fascinated by it because to me, it seems like, the far side of far right politics and some of these things. And then to also see people calling for its destruction. Then I'm like, I think some of those people may have more in common with Herbert Kirsten than they think they do, if that makes sense.
The thing is, when you take it out of the eugenics light, though, like, because it doesn't specify eugenics necessarily in there. I mean, most of the statements, if someone were to come across them after an apocalypse, they're at least a pretty decent set of founding principles. And it's weird that he has the white supremacist ties when he has it in all these different languages, including not white languages, you know?
Right. It makes it very, confounding in a lot of ways because he talks about developing a one world language out of that. But again, the fact that it was obviously made to accommodate a lot of different groups of people, whoever might come across it, it's sort of counterintuitive to the person that Kirsten was in his daily life.
Did you see the post? It was a fake post about what was inside the time capsule.
No, what was it?
Supposedly, which obviously this is all fake, but it was like Playgirl magazine with Burt Reynolds, and there were all of these Quaaludes.
Yeah.
And it was a bunch of just crazy stuff. But I actually had someone, I had an event this past weekend, and a guy came up to me and he was like, "Man, did you see this stuff about the Georgia Guidestones?" And I was like, "Yeah, He said, "They found the time capsule." And so he gets out the post and starts swiping through the photos, and I'm like, "This is fake." And then sure enough, it was a fake post. But I think Adam posted something about it on Twitter today, Go Ratley, about not getting to get his Quaaludes. So, but yeah, it was just one of those just nutty things. But I do think that this is like the ultimate irony. Who's the senator? The woman, or she's not senator. I'm sorry, she's a woman that's running for governor in Georgia, right?
Candace Taylor.
Yeah, and so she's telling everyone that this is like Satan. Again, it's like the second satanic panic is being fomented by all of these folks. And so here she is saying that this is going to open up a portal to, that allows Satan into the world, and someone blows it up the day that they turn CERN on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the same right-wing fascist extremism, and they blew up their own damn model.
Nathan, did you see the stories going around that it was actually a lightning bolt that struck it? So, God must have destroyed it.
Oh, did someone post that too?
That was going around before the video was released, where you can see the guy clearly running past it to throw the explosive on it.
Did they catch whoever did it?
They haven't yet, as far as I know.
Yeah, what I'm seeing right now says no motive has been publicly shared and no suspects publicly identified. So, and no arrests have been made.
It will be really funny if it turns out that it was somebody that was, more aligned with R.C. Christian, or who I assume it is to be the gentleman, Herbert. And the movie, what is it? Dark Clouds Over Elberton? Is that what the name of it is?
That's it.
Yeah, that's the documentary that the illustrious Dr. Future, friend of Conspiranormal podcast, put out. God, when was that? In the aughts?
That's available on YouTube, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'd highly encourage anybody that's got the time to go watch it or even scrub through bits of it.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, it's a long documentary, but Dr. Future put in the work and talked to the right people. And when you get to the end, it's sort of into the meat and potatoes of who Herbert Kirsten was. It's almost shocking when they start talking to his associates and things like that.
So Nathan, how long do you think it's going to take before a pennyroyal connection pops up and you're like, what the hell?
I don't know. Maybe, we were talking about it earlier. I did an interview with somebody and they were talking about some of the connections. And I've been watching some of the Dr. Future stuff. He's from Kentucky originally, right? Dr. Future?
I think so.
I do not know. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think he's from Louisville, and then he moved to Nashville, and then the TV show or the radio show. I was trying to catch up on this with the actual documentary. I was listening to an interview with Dr. Future earlier today about it, and I haven't seen the documentary yet, but in the documentary, do they actually address the inherent racism and fascism of this Dr. Kirsten?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe that's part of what it's about.
That's really the last 15 minutes or so are very much just like diving into how deep and open those beliefs were for him, including like his financial support of people like David Duke, being very happy to walk around and talk about white supremacist superiority and things like that. And you start to understand that on the surface, when he talks about controlling reproduction, and advocating for birth control and all these things, it by the end of it turns into weeding out people that are not superior, and that's why trying to control births.
Isn't it crazy that this has happened the week after the Roe versus Wade stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, it feels like everything's just kind of ramping up tension-wise.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I will say there is this Kentucky connection. The whole eugenics, the eugenics movement in America really began in Kentucky. We talk about it in the second season, but what's his name? Wycliffe Draper of the Draper family. They were the largest slave owners in Kentucky, and the family's like one of the grand old families of the South of the Confederacy, I guess. But they had a vast fortune, and Wycliffe Draper had flown to Germany, and prior to World War II was one of the main funders of eugenics research in Germany, and then came back to Kentucky, and about 10, 15 miles from Somerset to a place called Berea, and gave the college money, and the stipulation was that they would engage in eugenics research, and that everyone at the college had to be white. And pretty crazy stuff, though. But so then later on, the cloning movement. There's a guy in Lexington, Kentucky. He was affiliated with the group and the Drapers, decades later, and some weird funding between eugenics and cloning. And it's a weird, sordid history here in Kentucky.
That's fascinating. I do think we're going to have another reckoning around this topic as we get into more of being able to manipulate DNA and everything else when it comes to the health of, what's my child going to be like when it's born?
Yeah.
It starts with making sure they're not predisposed to diseases, but then it turns into, well, could I do something? Could we do something, medically that would contribute to more physical health or mental capability or whatever else?
Oh, it's certainly going to go that way.
Yeah, and so that's just going to be, this is going to be all these things are ongoing discussions. We know the right answers, but we have to revisit the topics over and over because the circumstances change.
Yeah, it's the whole transhumanism thing too.
It is.
Right. I'm curious what kind of adverse effects those types of genetic modifications might have on people, in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, isn't that one of the theories about the Graves is that they have worked themselves into a genetic bottleneck where they can't reproduce anymore? So
that's been the part of several mythologies, I think. The first one that comes to mind was that crazy, what was it, Dan Burisch? Do people remember him?
No.
Not familiar.
Okay, Dan Burisch was this guy that I think he became famous through Carrie Cassidy and the Project Camelot stuff. I'm digging, back before some of you might have gotten into this. But yeah, and he had this whole thing where what were they called? They were called J-rods, I think. And they had gotten to the point of genetic manipulation, and it was a whole timeline thing. Are we on the A, B, or C, D, A, B, C, or D timeline? And the Greys were coming back to these called J-rods to try to shift us to the correct timeline. Dan Burisch ended up being just like a janitor. He didn't work at any of these places that he said he worked.
Of course,
deep in the desert, right? Yeah.
Well,
sorry, I have dog wars going on behind me. Apologies.
The Project Camelot stuff. Like when I initially found it, I was looking at specific interviews, but the more I looked into it, the more I was like, oh, well, this is garbage. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. That was something that I saw as it was unfolding, just because of how long I've been into this stuff, and it's weird. And Bill Ryan was the other guy that was involved in that. And there's some sort of famous people that have come out of that. I think that sort of whole scene really influenced the Gaia, New Age crossover in this really big way. And was a big part of sort of along with the 90s zine scene, of that crossover between, that particular crossover between New Age and 5D consciousness expansion.
Right.
Blue avians. I'm conflating a lot of stuff. I had originally found her because, Graham Hancock and stuff were going on her show. And that, when Project Camelot started, there weren't a ton of paranormal type of things out there as far as podcasts and stuff go. No, that was one of the, particularly on the web. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm lucky to have started when I started, because it was after I started that suddenly it just became like everyone has a podcast,
I think definitely Coast to Coast fed into all of that Blue Avian stuff too.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
And it became, it's just like, what's up with Gaia TV? But obviously, it's so tied into the whole Coast to Coast crowd.
Yes, it's all about whatever you can exploit out of the crazy stuff.
Dude, it's a tangent. I did Coast to Coast for Penny Roll, and it was a disaster, and it was just terrible. I wasn't allowed to. You can't use a cell phone, and they want you to use, or you can use a cell phone, but they don't want you. You have to use a landline or cell phone. I couldn't use Skype. I couldn't use any of my professional recording equipment.
Which is crazy,
right? And I'm like, I can easily pop this in. They're like, nope, gotta call us on a cell phone and have a backup. I was like, okay. So I called and I said, does it sound okay? Should I switch to different phone? They're like, it's fine. And it was terrible, right? But after I did the show, all of these people accused me of being involved in the murders that happened here in 1994. And there was a bloodbath in the comments, man. And people were like coming at me, and I'm like, I was 14 years old.
So you were a young serial killer.
Yeah.
Right. But it just made me realize that the coast to coast, which I love coast to coast. I grew up on coast to coast.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And still listen to coast to coast. But it was just one of those things where I was like, man, this is a different crowd than the podcast, the community that we're all sort of a part of, I think. That they're digging into stuff. Like it just was a totally different vibe, and people were not willing to look deeper into anything. It's the whole, thing we talk about. It's like conspiracy without theory and conspiracy with theory that Michael Hughes was talking about,
Right. Yep.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah. So you may have to tell us all about the murders that you got accused of, just for people that aren't familiar, Nathan.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was the thing that kind of got the whole pennyroyal thing started, was I'd come down here with my wife. She's from Somerset, and we moved back here. And all these people had these signs downtown in the town square that said, you did it. And it was pointed at the mayor's office and the sort of the city council building. And so when I asked my neighbor about it, they revealed to me that there were these murders in 1994, very high profile murders on the 4th of July, right? Linda Gibson and Cody Garrett. She was 20 years old, 21 years old, and he was 4 years old. It was her half brother. And they were last seen at this gas station, like half a block from my house, right? Where we moved to. And that in 1994, on July the 4th, they were seen getting into this very prominent businessman's car. And then their bodies were found 3 days later on July the 7th in a hedgerow. And there are various stories about the circumstances of how their bodies were found. But suffice to say that part of them were in the city limits and part were outside the city limits, which caused this conflict, right, between the corrupt sheriff and the police department. And but the crazy thing is that supposedly, and this is all purported, I don't want to get sued for saying some of this stuff, but the driver was the driver of this guy named C.K. Cundiff, and he's the guy that built the pyramid in downtown Somerset after he went and climbed the Great Pyramid of Giza and had a vision that he needed to come back to Somerset and build this. It was to commemorate the 200-year anniversary of America also, right? It was in 1976. And there's an all-seeing eye. There's all kinds of crazy symbolism all over the thing. And he dedicated on July the 4th. And July the 4th is when these kids went missing. And so the car that they got into was driven by C.K. Cundiff's driver. And then 3 days later, that same driver drove the parents of the victims to where the bodies were. And they've never been able to pin it on the guy, but and the FBI have been investigating it, and Dateline did a story on it, for the 25th anniversary of it. But yeah, it's just one of those strange things, it definitely has weird occult overtones to it. And the guy's name too is Clinton Kennedy Cundiff, but he was born well before there was ever a Clinton or a Kennedy president, and this he was a Freemason. He was obsessed with esotericism, the weird symbolism of July the 4th and July the 7th. So anyway, I brought all this stuff up and people were like, you're the murderer.
Yeah. How does that work? How does that connection get made?
I was nervous. I laughed a little, at the wrong time.
Oh, okay.
So it was coast to coast. I was nervous,
Yeah.
telling the story. And anyway, but you should read the comments on the YouTube page sometime. It's pretty graphic.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, coast to coast pushes toward the lowest common denominator. Now, that doesn't mean that people like us can't enjoy the show sometimes, but they're not really interested in figuring any of this stuff out,
Yeah. Yeah, there wasn't any. They're just not. They're not going deeper into it and questioning any of it. The guy that blew up the Georgia Guidestones was probably not looking any deeper than what that lady running for governor.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And it's funny because you mentioned the new Satanic Panic, and on the other side of things, you have the Satanic Temple pushing for all our rights and stuff for all this different stuff, separation of church and state and all that. And of course they're using the satanic imagery behind it, which is just inciting the other side that much more.
There's a online sort of, I guess you call him an influencer or a personality or something, that calls himself Satan. And he wears like a little Satan mask and everything, and he pretends like he's sort of like the director of hell. And
there you go.
Yeah, you got to check him out. I think a lot of places he's S, the number 8, and then N. But he'll talk about like, well, of course I support this, but here's the thing: whoever I side with on this, it's a bad look for them. So,
there's also someone I know, he's on Facebook. I think he has a YouTube channel who just goes as God.
Oh, yeah, it's really
right. Are these the same people that have those names on Twitter? The S8N and God.
God has the South Park image.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
The Twitter one is the S8N guy. Yeah, that's the.
Yeah. Okay.
And he makes some good commentary here and there. And if anyone hasn't seen the documentary on the Satanic Temple, it's very, very well done. I don't remember what it's called though.
Hail Satan, I think.
Yes, yeah, that's it. Hail Satan. I
started to watch it. I don't know why I didn't finish it, but I need to finish it.
It's really interesting when they talk about how they had to kick one of the women out of the Satanic Temple because she was too extreme.
Yeah, right.
And you're too extreme for the Satanic Temple? I mean, I guess that's bragging rights.
Yeah.
That is definitely something. Oh my gosh.
I can never get it right, but I know. So the Satanic Temple, they're like an atheistic movement. They don't actually believe.
All Satanism is like,
right.
Unless
there's another one that is a theistic movement that actually believes in a very literal.
You mean, isn't there isn't that the split? And somebody's going to be screaming because I don't know my history, but there's Lavey, but then is it the temple? Is it Set? Is it the Set?
Temple of Set?
But it's not the Temple of Set.
No, okay.
It's a new one, and I can't remember. It's not the Church of Satan. I have to look it up. But I know that there's, in the current nomenclature, there's two big groups that are like just called Satanists, but one is very theistic and one is very atheistic.
So, in order to worship Satan, you have to be Christian. Like, right. Satan is part of the Christian pantheon, so you can't be, Hindu and worship Satan because Satan's not part of that,
and not even, and sort of arguably not really even part of the Christian pantheon. I mean, yet to get into like what the word Satan, where it comes from, and the conflation with Lucifer, and the conflation then with Pan and Baphomet, and Baphomet being a corruption of Muhammad. It gets really, to say that like Satan is Christian. I think it's like it's one of those things that a lot of people think historically it's always been there.
Sure.
But you could say the same thing about God, because like El and Elohim are part of the Canaanite pantheon, and all those gods got lumped in together to create the Abrahamic God. But those all started from a polytheistic pantheon.
Yes,
they did, and then you ended up with a situation where even though you believed in that God, you knew there were others. They just weren't your God.
Yeah,
right. El's God thing, it just doesn't track.
Yeah, and El had what was it? What was his wife's name? Or his female aspect that got sort of omitted after.
I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the name.
Yeah, it's not Ashtoreth. It's
I think it is.
Yeah, I think it is too.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It is.
Yeah, I think you got it. There's also other earlier like monotheistic religions like Zoroastrianism.
Sure.
And what is
what's the pharaoh that wanted it all to be a monotheistic thing, and then he got
Cyrus?
Yeah,
Cyrus.
No, that's not monotheistic.
No, you're thinking of what is it? Akhenaten.
Yeah. Akhenaten. Yes. Yeah, that was a mess.
Yeah.
But and you figure Satan starts out as like the opposer in the Bible. He's not named Satan.
It means adversary.
Yeah, adversary, opposer. And like Baphomet was the symbol of the Knights Templar, was not a satanic symbol until the church turned on the Knights Templar because they had too much power and money, and then they turned their symbol into a satanic symbol because they needed to get rid of them.
Yeah, and conflated with things like Pan and other,
What's really interesting, I have a friend who's very Catholic, and I tried to get him into, like, he thinks that a lot of the grimoire stuff is heresy, is blasphemous. And the reason he hates it so much is because in most of the grimoires, specifically the Grimoire Verum and the Sworn Book of Honorius, which was supposedly written by a pope, don't know if that's true or not, but the hell is controlled by a triumvirate. It's Lucifer, Satan, and Beelzebub, and then in some grimoires it has it as Ashtoreth, Lucifer, and Satan, and then others. So I've always been interested to see where that came from.
Huh.
So he feels like that's heresy?
Yeah, because it goes against the canon.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
As hell is ruled by one figure, and not.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when LaVey and Tim Renner told me that LaVey actually stole most of his stuff from someone else, but I don't remember who it was.
Yes.
Something the Red.
Right.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
But I mean, LaVey's system was atheistic. It was almost like a socio-political system.
Yeah.
It was like libertarianism with really cool graphics.
Yes.
Super edgy.
Yeah, and
you could extend that to Crowley. Some of his ideas would look very atheistic in today's nomenclature, with everything being more of the psychological model than anything spiritual.
Yeah, and again, he had that libertarianism sort of bend to his ideas as well.
Right.
I think that's definitely true for some of Crowley's earlier stuff, but there are definitely aspects of his writing that verge on even the monotheistic in some ways.
Right. I mean, I think the in Thelema there is the Gnostic Catholic Mass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, he was raised in that Christian sect that I forget the name of.
The Plymouth Brethren.
That's it. The Plymouth.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, they were extremely fundamentalist. So, I mean, all that stuff was there in his upbringing. And I don't think he, even though he rebelled against it, I think it still formed a lot of his base ideas.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, definitely. And real quick, Octavian, just some cursory Googling. I'm just finding theistic Satanism. I'm not finding any other kind of name for it. It just seems to be a common term. Also, traditional Satanism was lumped in there, too, although I don't know that that's accurate.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one. I just remember there being a group back like probably 5 years ago who really did not like being called the Satanic Temple because they were atheistic and this group was theistic, and they were very adamant about keeping that as the part of their identity.
And it wasn't Church of Satan, you said?
No, because that's all very atheistic.
Yeah.
That's all, self-empowerment kind of thing.
Yeah, there's also Luciferianism, but that's like its own separate thing.
That goes into like Gnosticism and stuff like that.
Yeah. So,
and then
Satan.
Michael Aquino created the
Temple of Set.
Temple of Set in Kentucky while he was at the Fort Campbell or Fort Knox military base.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That stuff also tends to verge into some white supremacy areas with some of the.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a story. There's a story too that we uncovered, which I can't remember. This is true though. There's a fake story about Anton Lavey and John Kerry being at a museum together, but there's a real story which I can't think of it off the top of my head because I never thought we'd venture into this territory of discussion. but and it's not anything we even talked about in the show. But Anton Lavey was touring. I think it was Fort Knox, or it was one of the ancillary museums. I think maybe just a military, like a tank one. And there was I can't remember which president it was touring it at the same time. And we found all these news clippings where they shut down the place and the two of them took the tour together with the Secret Service. Right.
I love
Interesting.
it.
Well, I mean, LaVey was sort of a pop culture icon of the time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What's that anecdote about like Jacques Vallée and Ami Michel and Anton Lavey hanging out at Vallée's house in San Francisco, and something about watching the Black Pope play Donkey Kong with his daughter.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that is really awesome. I mean, the Satanic Temple changed a lot of that sort of selfish sort of stuff that Anton Lavey put out there, which I approve of highly, getting rid of that stuff.
They went way more like for the people kind of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting to watch them do things like talk about accepting people for who they are. You know, like they're not trying to make other people Satanists. It's like, you know, you're free to believe what you want, but leave other people alone. And then you have the religious people being like, you need to shut up. And it's like, but okay.
I've told this story a couple times on my show, but like when I was a teenager, you know, like I'm like very immersed in black metal and, you know, extreme metal, and that's just, you know, Satan across the board with obviously some paganism in there.
And the occasional Christian black metal band.
Oh yeah, the white metal.
Yeah.
But when I was, 13, 14, really wanting to get into magic, that was what I was exposed to, was Satanism and left-hand path stuff. So I would go to these shows, and I would go up to someone who maybe had like a pentagram necklace or an inverted cross necklace, and be like, hey, do you like practice left-hand path stuff? And like, yes. I'm like, well, could you like show me? Because I don't know where to start. I'm very confused. I'm young. I just want to get into this. Well, if you don't know, I can't show you. And that turned me off completely for years. I hated that attitude.
It's because they had no idea themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But no, that is a tenet in a lot of left-hand path stuff, is like, you have to find it yourself. If anyone shows it to you, then it's not valid, basically.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, but those guys just didn't know, and they were just being cool about it. You know, it's all image.
That always seemed like the older kids in high school,
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, we probably all had that experience at some point. I think that's a universal part of
absolutely
people like us.
I don't know enough about like left-hand path kind of stuff specifically, but in general, I guess with like magical topics or the esoteric, I've always found people pretty open to sharing. For the most part, I mean, there are some people out there who are either they don't know and they're just putting on an image, or they're super secretive about what they're doing or whatever. But a lot of the times, at least in my experience, people are pretty open. So I was kind of surprised to hear that, Octavian, when you whenever I'd first heard you mention that.
Yeah,
not terribly surprised. But.
Yeah, it was because like I kept getting all these people who were on the show, and I've been into the occult since I was 13. I've been the occult since I was 12, and I always got really jealous because I just remember being that age, trying to get into the occult, and my only real exposure to it was the left-hand path, and so I had that experience, and it totally turned me off to actually ever trying it.
We went into this quite a bit in the last show, the right and left-hand path thing. To the way I've always understood it, right-hand path is abstinence with life, and left-hand path is indulgence. So a right-hand path mystic is one who withdraws from life and material belongings and focuses just on raising consciousness and rejoining whatever path they're looking to do. Whereas someone on the left-hand path doesn't reject the world, but actually indulges in physical stuff while also trying to attain that higher state of consciousness.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason why I asked this is because, and I'll just give you like a scenario and see how you react. So let's say somebody does a right-hand path ritual with the full abstinence, fasting, praying, making a circle with the names of God. He summons a chthonic spirit, or they, and then asks charges the spirit with killing someone. Even though they went through a right-hand path system, does that make them a left-hand path because of the objective ritual?
No, the right and left have nothing to do with what you're doing. It's how you're doing it.
Okay. All right, I understand.
And even like if you use terms like white and black magic, I mean, I believe Crowley was the one that defined white magic as anything that is focused on communication with your holy guardian angel. Black magic is anything that's not, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's negative. It just means it's not focused on that one pure spiritual pursuit.
It's interesting that there's such a dichotomy between these terms. But I guess the more I look at it, the more I think about this type of stuff, I see a lot of vagary.
Oh yeah.
Like I see, intersections and crossovers and, like Octavian was just mentioning, people who may have, some motivations in some direction or whatever, and believe they're doing it one way when they're actually doing it a different way, or whatever. I guess I haven't seen it as being much of the methodology, so much as being involved with the intention. But I also don't know, and I haven't practiced.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky, it's a tricky argument, I think, that comes up, and you have somebody like, Dr. Stephen Skinner, who would very much say that you have to have the exact type of blade, right. With the exact type of metal, with the exact type of, sharpness on the exact moment, and it really is a science. And I know there's some people like Ren really, believes that, and has had, I think, effective, experiments with that. Whereas there are, many people that it's really casual, fast and loose. There's no,
that would be me,
yeah. And personally, I think that you have to think about it, where these rules are coming from. Like, if there is a set of rules, are you assuming that these are natural laws that have been here since the beginning of time? Or are these things that are maybe, as the collective unconscious moves through the cycles of history, are we impacting and, putting things out there that then become part of the paranormal world? So, at some point, grimoires, didn't work because there was, they didn't come from anything. There's no natural law to say that they work. And grimoires anyway are just basically magical diaries. So, it's not like they were written by, a particular authority. This is the same argument you can get into about the Bible, but we don't have time for that. Yeah. So so I think, like, this is where the experimentation, this is where, the application of science to the art, I think, can yield really great results. Is that when you experiment with things, you have to find what works for you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's at least my experience.
I really want to hear Nathan's thoughts on this stuff.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a lot of pressure. I don't know, man. Like, that's the thing with me with all this stuff. My coming into this, I had no background, and still have no background in magic, right? And so much of what we've found in the Pennyroyal mystery involved, magical practitioners or people that were performing magic of various things. Of course, when I first entered this whole space of thought, everything was the devil, right? And so, like, it was all devil worshippers that were doing this, and there was some type of satanic cabal, doing things, which is ridiculous, right? And whenever we really looked deeper into it, there were various magical groups. I mean, obviously the Bate Cabal were an active organization, active magical group here. And then recently I spoke with, when people watch Hellier and they talk about a green man cult and this idea that somebody could have been worshiping, Sunernos. It turns out that the Guidonic Order, a group of Welsh magicians, actually did move, to Somerset in 2004. And so it's like, but they had a whole other approach to magic, right? And so somebody hooked me up with them 2 weeks ago, and with two former members of that group. And so I was asking them about Welsh magic and what kinds of rituals they were performing in the area. But again, it's like what they were doing here is totally different from the magical rituals that were published by the Bate Cabal in the Cincinnati, Journal of Ceremonial Magic. So it's like all of these different, they're all these different systems, but they're all obviously aiming at the same effect, right? The same ability to change reality. And for me, in terms of just the way that I've interacted with this, it seems to me that the idea of chaos magic makes the most sense. The idea of trying to stack coincidences to cause and effect on reality. Seems to be, to me, to make the most sense in terms of what magic is, and that involves in the Seriah, we've talked about this, the decreasing of randomness. Yeah. Does that make sense? Did I go totally off topic there?
Yeah, you're fine.
No, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, Nathan, like, I relate to that a lot because I had a mentor I grew up with that was an artist obsessed with creation, and he had quotes from different spiritual figures, mythic figures, quantum equations on the walls in the studio and things like that. And that influenced me, like creating rituals and what have you. But I never thought of it as magic until I got exposed to chaos magic later on. And it was sort of like, oh, I've been doing this the whole time. I just didn't know that I was.
Yeah. And then, you know, I've got to meet Celeste, who's in the show in the second season, Celeste Mont. She introduced me to a friend of hers in New Orleans, Joshua Madera, and he uses, you know, technology, like builds actual ritual circuits, and then uses programming languages to interact with these basically sigils that are circuits when you complete them. I mean, I highly recommend looking at his work because he's taken all sorts of traditional, what we would consider traditional magical rituals or ceremonial magic, and then interpreted them through the creation of an actual electronic device that uses code to, I guess, create an effect, right? And he's done a lot of stuff with randomness as well. But, you know, he's the one that really told me the most about Pete Carroll and chaos magic, and kind of pushed me to look at that. But again, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I still don't know. I still don't understand any of it, you know, and then to have someone like Dan Dutton, the artist Dan Dutton here in town, well-known Kentucky artist, an American artist, but he has magical ritual built into his artworks, but not in any overt way, right? Like magic and the principles of magic. And again, you know, he's one of the last singers of the child ballads, which arguably form a basis for the Wiccan religion, right? Or, you know, purportedly. But, you know, when you look at the child ballads and when you look at these sort of like formulas that are built into it, and then he created all these works, it's like he's not even trying to do a magical ritual, but every act of creating art is a magical ritual for him. It just doesn't have a system. Right?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, that sort of is magic. It's art.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. That's what there were a lot of artists that were doing that. And I say that only, you know, with a little bit of expertise in that, you know, my graduate degree is not specifically in filmmaking, but it's in media studies. And a lot of the artists that I was working with, you know, that I had was fortunate enough to work with, were sort of from like the 60s art scene, and they were really heavily influenced by the magical revival going on there. It wasn't separate, you know, so a lot of the weird experimental art, you know, in this case it was film, and I'm not just talking about like Kenneth Anger, but a lot of stuff out there was really heavily like much more in the way that you're talking about how Dan Dutton was doing it, you know, were influenced by this. I mean, for some people might not know, like John Cage, who was a very famous classical composer, avant-garde composer. He, you know, famously did this piece, which was just silence, you know, so the piano player just sits there. And he was very heavily influenced by the I Ching, by the Book of Changes, and indeterminacy, and ideas, you know, of indeterminacy from the occult, you know. So this drawing of some sort of muse or spiritual possession that is taking over or channeling through you. And it's really cool. I mean, if you look back at it, how much of that was, subtly part of it, and very much the same way that you're talking about. And I'm sure that Dan was influenced, knew some of these people.
Yeah, he's brought up Cage before. Yeah, and you also think about the situationists, right? I mean,
oh yeah, completely. The Dreve.
Yeah, with the Dreve and like this idea of like the drift, and then the cut up techniques, right? Yep. The exquisite corpse, where it's like you just said, it's the indeterminacy of it, which allows the space for the magical act. To really
and that's coming from and that's also influenced by the Surrealists, who were influenced very much by the prior magical revival. I mean, this is Crowley and Austin Osman Spare, who were influencing, the Surrealists, who then sort of gave way to the Situationists. It's funny, I'd love to see sort of a map of magical revivals and art movements kind of superimposed on each other. Timeline.
Yeah. It's interesting because chaos magic, when I first started getting into magic, I mean, my gateway to magic was, and I've said this so many times, but a both traumatic and religious, beautiful mushroom trip where my ego was completely, I didn't have an ego death, but it was an ego dissolution. And I came out of that like, okay, so reality is not real. Like, nothing is true, everything is permitted kind of thing. And so I got Liber Null and I got a bunch of Phil Hine books, and I read through Liber Null and I tried sigil magic stuff, and it didn't do anything. I didn't feel anything. It just didn't really do anything. So I go to Condensed Chaos. And what I found, for me at least, is that chaos magic works so much better as a philosophy than an actual system. Because Phil Hine made a big point about killing your dogma completely, doing whatever works. And obviously this Anton Wilson thing as well. Yeah. But that led me to ceremonial magic, because for me, I am a very chaotic person just in my own life, and I work very chaotically. But what I kind of need to get started with that is order and a system to break down. Does that make sense? So I need something to destroy first. And then, and so then I started looking at ceremonial magic, and, I'm a dirty pagan. The God stuff, it really did not sit well with me, but I started to look at it and I started to see the similarities between certain things that, like, very traditional, very old school ceremonial magicians were doing, and the interactions they were having, and then kind of overlaying that with paranormal stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, here's this technique that supposedly works and has been working for thousands and thousands of years. Let's try and use that on the paranormal and see what we get. So I've kind of come at ceremonial magic from a chaos point of view and using it in a chaos way, sort of.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, Octavian. I thought about that a little bit too, because the stuff that probably would be the most effective for me to try is the stuff that I'm afraid of.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm like, obviously that's probably the most effective thing.
Like what?
If I were going to take on like, angelic magic or any of these other things that are outside of the wheelhouse that I play in. But I have a certain set of, like, growing up in the poor South, there are certain beliefs that, even though intellectually I don't believe them anymore, are still sort of just culturally embedded in some part of my mind. And so I think that almost adds a stronger framework for different practices.
Do you mean like hoodoo or?
No, but like a fear of ritual magic or something like that. Because
gotcha.
I grew up in the 80s during the Satanic Panic, and so it was like, oh, you can't do this, or this, or whatever. Because I grew up in a world where that stuff was very real. That Satan and all this and fire and brimstone. Yada,
it can be very difficult to sort of exercise some of those, preconceived, those deeply rooted things. Yeah. I certainly have, come across that for sure.
One of the things that really resonates with me, Saxon, because one of my issues is I have a couple, I have ADHD, but with that comes this thing called executive functioning disorder, which it basically means that when I am given a task, I need it to be really specific, because for some reason I'm only going to probably hear the first part, or I'm not going to, if it's multiple parts, I'm not going to connect them. It's a whole thing. But looking at ceremonial magic and how strict and how many components and aspects there are to it, it scares the crap out of me, because it flies completely in the face of my issue. So I basically have to confront that to even begin doing it. I haven't done one yet because I still have to figure out how, and there's a lot that scares me about it. Just like, if this goes wrong, then what do I do then? If that goes wrong, then what do I do then? It's a very daunting task, but part of that also invigorates me and motivates me to actually really get into it.
That's really interesting. That anxiety about it, though, is exactly what drives me to try to practice a more sort of organic form of magic, I guess you could say. But yeah, if it drives you, especially if it inspires you to learn it and to practice it, by all means.
Yeah. Also, ceremonial magic for me is a means to an end. It's because, one of my goals with it, and I haven't really talked about this publicly because it's a very half-baked theory, but I essentially want to create a polytheistic system of ceremonial magic, because I want to do what these guys are doing, but without the names of God and without these chthonic spirits. I want to evoke trolls and gnomes and things like that. So I'm trying to learn the system so that way I can augment it.
Yeah, pick them apart and create.
That sounds awesome. So, speaking of like safe kinds of magic or whatever that we're comfortable with, I'm kind of more like Taylor, where I take an organic approach and that chaos magic ideas, but and also crossing over with the artist and creator side of this. I love Grant Morrison. Chris and I have talked about Grant on the show many times. Mm-hmm. And I love Jack Kirby. And I think Jack Kirby was an incredible illuminated magician. He just didn't know that he was. But he had a device he created in his comics that talked to the source of the universe. And it was like a little computer called a mother box that you wore on your body. And so I have a tattoo of a mother box on my side with a little open area for a sigil. And so if I do something like sigil magic, I'll put the sigil in Sharpie inside of that place on the tattoo and let it fade out.
So what does that box look like?
I'll send you a picture of it.
For listeners, can you describe it though?
I mean, it's a rectangle box. Jack drew it a lot of different ways, but it's got a lot of sort of like zigzag lines with a circle in the middle.
Yeah, Kirby's art was sort of like, imagine almost like there's almost like a Mesoamerican futuristic style to it. Yeah.
I'll drop it in the chat.
It's a very cool art style. Really interesting.
On Google, I'm seeing a variety of different iterations of its appearance.
Yeah. The I'll show. I'll find the image of the one that I have tattooed and send it in.
That's so crazy, dude, that you made yourself a part of it that way. You know what I mean? Like that's a fascinating device. And was it Kirby and Grant Morrison? Didn't they both have interactions with tulpic entities, like that they created themselves through their works?
I don't know if Kirby did, but Grant Morrison he essentially had an abduction experience. He was in, I think, Kathmandu in Nepal on a balcony, and he got basically, his consciousness got sucked up by these entities, and he was taken through the solar system, and I forget the specifics of it, but yeah, he had a pretty serious experience, and that was prior, I think, to the Invisibles. Does that ring a bell with you, Saxon?
Yeah, it does. I think that's it exactly. And some of the disinfo guides and things out there, he recounts that if people are looking for a place to read about it. Kirby, I don't know if he ever talked about anything like that happening, but his imagination was so broad and really dealt with trying to personify fundamental forces within reality and multiple realities that you end up with these sort of archetypal elements like the living tribunal that judges everything, or eternity that's sort of like a consciousness of the universe, But it just, I don't know. The stuff is, it's almost its own pantheon that you can just pick and choose from as you need to.
So speaking of sigils, since Saxon, you'd mentioned that tattoo, Nathan, you mentioned somebody earlier who had was like doing some electronic creations with sigils. What would you say his name was? I missed that.
Joshua Madera.
Madera?
Yeah, Madera. He goes by a different name online, but that's his actual. Is he a student of philosophy down there? I can't remember what his actual academic background, but yeah, he creates these electronic sigils.
That's fascinating. I'm really interested in that kind of stuff, so I wanted to get that down so I could look it up later.
I'll send you the picture of some of his work too, that he sent me, because I'm telling you, man, it's crazy. Like books that, like when you open the books up, they're like grimoires, but the books have all these circuits through them, and so when you plug up yourself to the book, you complete the circuit, and it completes the sigil, like exactly what you know. Just it's totally transgressive work, you know. I mean, it's fantastic.
Oh, that's awesome. Like, I'm just imagining like running that over and over in the background too, or something like that, you know.
Well, yeah, so that's something that what do you guys think about this? Because I mean, Darian West, who's my research partner on a lot of this stuff, and he's the one that really develops the software. You know, we talk through the theory behind it, but we've done some stuff with VR, and a lot of stuff with Dan Dutton, with the VR stuff, with the whole pan element to the mystery. But and Darian's the one that created this sort of randomness detector that's based off of the project with the eggs, the Princeton eggs, you know. Being able to detect, you know, randomness in the world, but also local randomness. Yeah. The idea being that if magic is real, or even if something has an effect on reality, if you're extending your will to control or have an effect on reality, it's going to decrease. It's going to become more deterministic, which means less. You know, there's going to be an increase in, or a decrease in randomness, basically locally.
Right.
And so we're able to do that, and we've used it with a lot of magical rituals, having actual magicians perform the rituals, and then we ran the generator to see if the ritual they were performing actually caused, that decrease in randomness locally. But that led us to start to talk about the idea of, could we program into a VR sequence an actual ceremonial ritual of magic, but then cause that to be run, algorithm, a million times in a second, right?
Oh, okay.
Like because you would create a virtual ritual space, right? So you would actually still have the circle or wherever that you're actually going to focus the magical ritual. And then through programmed actors, it would create this, but also you could create a feedback loop so that each, basically each iteration of the algorithm would be feeding into the next iteration, right? So it would be this buildup of information.
Oh, that's so cool.
But I mean, but people have criticized that idea of trying that, because they're saying that, to us, the criticism was, it requires an actual living practitioner. That I think even Wren had mentioned this with his potential criticism was, if you're dealing with spirits, these algorithms and these virtual entities that you've created to perform the rituals can't interact with these other intelligences that are potentially brought into the ritual.
Well, so that's a very interesting point, and I tend to lean that way myself. But I also don't think it's impossible. I think we don't know enough about how magic works on a consciousness level to really say one way or another that we couldn't get for lack of a better explanation, a computer to do magic. I guess I would ask, if you're talking about like doing it, many times in a second, what would be the intended benefit? Is it to amplify the effect?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that would be. But again, I mean, this is coming from having no magical background, in terms of just like looking at rituals, and if you stacked rituals on top of each other algorithmically. But I don't know. I mean, within the realm of magical systems, is that superfluous?
I think someone sent me, I think it was my friend who sent me an article about a computer that was able to do a grimoire ritual, or either write one or something like that. It was really interesting. If I can find it, I'll post it in the chat.
Yeah, if you could send that, I'd be curious to look at that. It's a tough question. I think when it comes to performing magic and getting magical effects out of the stuff that you're doing, and Seriah always kind of goes back to Crowley's "beware lust for result" kind of a thing. I think it has to be natural. I think and by that I don't mean without electronics. I mean it has to be something that kind of flows. It can't really be forced. Because if it is forced, it tends to break down or backfire, at least in my experience.
Well, so here's what I'm wondering. This experiment could potentially show us how much a ritual is important versus the human component.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if you have the human component focusing on the electronic ritual, almost as an amplifier, so you have the intent, you have the human component, but then you have the computer running the algorithm.
The other thing you could do with that is crowdsource the intention to a bunch of different people, and have a lot of different people focus on that intention alongside the mechanism. That might you could do iterations on this and see which ones work better, which ones don't work. And if you can boil it down to, this is the thing that works the best, and we can sort of determine. For instance, it has something to do with human consciousness. It has something to do with intention, and letting the intention seep into the subconscious, and then moving on, or whatever. If you can find out kind of what that is, you may be able to capture that and build a system to make that happen electronically.
I mean,
maybe not.
Maybe rituals have created almost like an egregore of activation, And so a computer could potentially activate it, but you would still need human consciousness to give it direction.
Yeah.
So, Seriah, I like what you talk about of whether or not it can tell you if having the human interaction as being necessary. You could probably do this a couple of different ways, because I love what Taylor said too about having crowdsourcing the interaction. We've talked a lot on the show about people going camping and things like that, and how the act of getting ready to go out into the woods becomes a ritual in and of itself. And especially if you've had a lot of people going to the same place, that starts stacking up those rituals that each person does day after day after day, going to a park or national forest or something like that. So if you have 100 people initiating the same magical program, that could be something. I would be really curious to see what the results of all that were.
Well, in a way, Michael Hughes and other people who are related to that experiment sort of tried it with the
exactly.
Yeah, the candle experiment, and was it new moons? Or they were trying to do rituals on a regular basis across a large group of people to get Trump out of office. Essentially, was the goal.
And stuff like that has been done before. Mike did it. I mean, that's not a new thing.
Yeah, and supposedly they were doing that during World War II. Supposedly, like Dion Fortune and Crowley were.
Yeah. And I wonder how effective that kind of stuff is. I don't know. It's hard to tell.
And that's where Nathan's, looking at this randomness stuff is interesting, because it might be one of the ways we can tell.
Yeah. I mean, that would be the thing, is like, while it's running this program, right, or a magical ritual, whatever the iteration of the project, the experiment is, I love the idea of having the different intentions and crowdsourcing it, right, and seeing that in the background. And then what you're always testing for is what consistently drops the level of randomness below the Shannon threshold, so that it's deterministic, right? It's showing the effect of collective will or individual will on reality, right?
Yeah, and if you do that many, many times, you can capture that data and find ways to perform analytics on it and stuff. That actually, that kind of brings me to a question I had for you, Nathan. I've heard you talk about, doing data science, data analytics and stuff like that with the research you guys have done. I was curious. Over the last year, have sort of stumbled into the role of data engineer in my professional life, and I was thinking a lot about this and trying to figure out, or just thinking about what can we do with data science, and what can we do with analytics and with capturing large amounts of data on experiments, for instance, that could help us better understand spirit or magic or whatever. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, it's so weird how we ended up doing this, because like Darian and I had started out, we had gotten hired by a company in St. Louis to basically data mine all the VIN numbers in America and translate them through to cross-reference OEM numbers on catalytic converters.
Okay.
and so there was a lot of like creating sort of dictionaries that allowed the data to communicate with itself. And then we also built a dating app in New York for people that were sober. So we're doing all this like data mining of objects, and then data mining of people's personalities, and then trying to match personalities too. And so anyway, then all the pennyroll stuff was happening. So it was like he was already writing a lot of these algorithms, these data mining algorithms, and using some of this AI, tying into some of that stuff, machine learning for the analysis that we started to try to do it with this. And then that's, he built a thing that's called ChannelBot, and we use it in our lodge, the Patreon we have in the group. And so, he used the Crowley's book,
Book of the Law.
Yeah, the Book of Law as sort of the codex, right? And so you can ask a question, and you're supposed to have an intention, ask a question, and then it starts running through every sentence and every word in the Book of the Law. And then when it drops below the Shannon threshold that's set, it pulls that word out and starts to answer your question, right? So it's like a weird form of like divination, basically.
Yeah.
But you can use any text, right? And then we started tying it into record players. So we would like buy a random record at a record shop that's a spoken word record. Then we would put it on, and then we would tie it into the system on an old record player, not a digital one. It won't work on that, but on something that just like it powers up and spins and powers down, right? Mm-hmm. And so every time it dropped below the Shannon threshold and randomness decreased, the record would fire up, and then it would speak a series of words that were in response to a question we asked, right? And so there was a lot of like trying to contact something to see if there was an effect on reality. But again, it's so much of what we've been doing involved that, but then seeing the work of like Joshua Madera, and there are other people too. And especially when you look at like the CCRU, I know Nick Land Nick Land definitely is I don't want to say he's a despicable person because he's still alive, but Nick Land was pushing some very bad, social theories.
I only know about that guy because of the whole Georgina Rose controversy.
Accelerationism is a pretty bad thing, and there's a lot of like fascism tied into it. But
and there are a lot of sort of occult influencers that are closeted or not so closeted accelerationists, I think.
Yeah.
Now, what's acceleration?
Oh man. Oh god.
I don't even understand it. And I like once this whole thing happened about this girl influencer on TikTok and Instagram getting outed as some kind of neo-Nazi, like the whole that question came up, and I still don't really understand it.
I mean,
I've never heard of it.
I mean, the accelerationists believe that if you can accelerate capitalism through technology, that you can collapse society, and that ultimately there would be these sort of corporate fiefdoms formed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Basically around tech companies run by these technological philosophers who know better through data how to push humans. And then it became part of transhumanism. Gets rolled in there, and really when the transhumanism stuff gets in there, then the eugenics stuff pops up, right?
Right, yeah.
And it's a heavily racist philosophy, very white philosophy about basically trying to get us to where we can collapse using Bitcoin. There's this idea that Bitcoin may have been created as an accelerationist, technology to try to destabilize the global markets. I mean, it's weird stuff, but definitely, the CCRU, when they were before Nick Land went full on, fascist kind of stuff, which again, this is arguably fascist in terms of a corporation controlling everybody's lives, right? In these fiefdoms, but the CCRU, the Cybernetic Control Research Unit, and Sadie Plant. And I've talked to, I've corresponded with Ron Eglash, and there are others that were part of this, but they were definitely, this is the early 90s, and before it went off the rails with the cult of personality of Nick Land, they were really pushing the envelope of trying to marry technology and language and programming and coding with magic and with this sort of the altering of consciousness through technology in order to get to a magical state, right? And so it's one of those like throw the baby out with the bathwater things where you worry about touching anything that's from the CCRU because of Nick Land, but I think those guys were definitely trying to do some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But again, it's like what we've talked about before. It's reclaiming that narrative, right? So even if there were some white supremacist fascists that were, promulgating these theories, now's the time to take those ideas back from them and to recontextualize those narratives and those experiments and do them and not marry them to racist ideologies,
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right. Can everyone stick around for a Patreon?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, because we're out of time. So let's go down the list here. Let's start with Mr. Chris.
If you want to see some of the movies that I worked on, including The Hill and the Hole with the wonderful Adam Gorightly, done by me and the great Bill Darman, you can go to Trauma or Amazon Prime and check that out. And you can also see my film Corpse on Amazon. And look forward to having something out this year later, hopefully.
Yeah, what's that going to be?
It's about this weird podcast called Where'd the Road Go?
All right. Octavian.
You can find me at strangedominionspodcast.com. We have a YouTube. We're on all the regular streaming platforms as well. So if you have an interest in magic and the paranormal, come on down.
Taylor.
I'm doing the Green Line podcast. Just had a summer episode come out a couple weeks ago, so that's available. And also Sigil Arcanum Tarot. And other than that, just hanging around here.
All right. Nathan.
You can check out the Pennyroll podcast on any platform or our Patreon, The Liminal Lodge. We're starting up production on season 3, and obviously I want to talk to all of you about some of this stuff off the air for the show. So
lovely.
And Super Inframan can be found lurking around various social media platforms, waiting for the sign for him to transform and come rescue people.
Absolutely. And I would also encourage anybody to be a Patreon of Where Did the Road Go if they are not already.
Thank you.
Support the work and the stuff that you like, people. It's always a good thing.
Yes. All right. Thank you all, and we'll continue this in a Patreon conversation. I want to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons. Without you, this show wouldn't be possible. And I especially want to shout out to those pledging $10 or more. Allison Cook, Super Inframans, 36 Dingo, Chuck Shutters, Leanne Sherry, CJ, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Christine, a blue 2nd Gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Gaia Quinta, Alex Whitcomb, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Big Boy Limina, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, land of the crazy and communicable, Christopher Ernst, Craig Cicernos, Craig Parmenter, Crystal Ann Compton, Diane B., Edu Camahort, Empty K, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, J. Otto Bullitt, James Lattimore, Joanna Rojas, John Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Linz Jackson K., Luke Osborne, MJ Armstrong, Jim and Sophie, Mark Brady, Matt in Delaware, Patricia W., Paul Jeffries, Ray Benedetto, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Stone Wilderness, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Vincent Trewell, Walker, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Stephen D., and Amber Hall. Thank you all so very, very much. So there's a lengthy Patreon segment that will be included later this week from this show. I hope everyone enjoyed it. A lot of people were asking me to bring Nathan in on a roundtable, and it was already in the works because I had the same thought. He'd fit really well with one of our roundtables, and we will do it again as well. If you haven't checked out Pennyroyal, check out both seasons. They're different, and they're really, really good. Also, check out wheredidtheroadgo.com because that is where you will find everything related to this show, all our social media links, every single show back to the very first one in January of 2013, links to our Patreon, links to donate, Discord, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, other stuff. There's lots of stuff there. There really is. So go check that out. There's a merch store as well for TeePublic. I'm going to be putting up one hopefully for Redbubble as well. Some people told me that Redbubble is a preference to them, and someone had already bootlegged my shirts on Redbubble, so yeah, that's cool. So there'll be official stuff up on Redbubble hopefully soon. Becoming a patron is only $3 a month. You get extra stuff almost every single week. There's almost always an extra segment to a show unless it's just not possible to do that particular week. And some extra special stuff in between. So you get a lot for that $3, and it really helps us out here and helps me keep this show going strong. I have not missed a week. You have gotten a show every single week since I started in 2013, sometimes more. Also, for those of you who are into metal or heavier or darker music, I do a weekly show called The Last Exit for the Lost. And you can find it at thelastexit.org. You can listen, weekly. That's also a weekly show. 6.5 hours of old and new music, metal, punk, industrial, experimental stuff, some comedy music, some all kinds of stuff, really. It's really hard to put into words. But if that sounds up your alley, you can check it out live every week, or you can listen to our extensive back catalog of shows. And we have a live performance space, some of which I've played at the end of this show from different bands. So on a fairly regular basis, we have live music streaming on YouTube from some very, very talented bands. And I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.